Welcome to another thrilling Fated Mates werewolf romance audiobook, A Werewolf's Claim. If you are new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating werewolf romance stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. Excited to have you here again. Shall we begin? Act 1. The Descent of the Storm. The road stretched ahead, a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through the skeletal embrace of the autumn race. Dying leaves fluttered in the crisp air, a swirl of burnt oranges and deep reds carried by the restless wind. The sun, slipping lower on the horizon, cast long shadows over the trees, streaking the sky in shades of dusky violet and molten gold. Aurora Reed tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her fingers flexing against the smooth leather. The road had been empty for miles now, just her and the trees, the low hum of the car's engine, the only sound besides the occasional rustle of wind through brittle branches. It was the kind of silence that felt thick, as though the world held its breath. Perfect. She inhaled deeply, the scent of damp earth and distant pine creeping through the cracked window. This was exactly what she had wanted: the open road, the wilderness pressing in, the sense that she was moving towards something unknown. No deadlines, no expectations, no one to answer to. She had spent too much of her life boxed in by responsibilities that didn't feel like hers. A stable job in an office that drained the light from her eyes. A relationship that had fizzled into something dull and polite. A love story that had never really been written. The city, with its towering glass buildings and endless noise, had begun to feel like a cage. So she had left. Not in some dramatic, scorched earth kind of way. There had been no storming out, no tearful goodbyes. Just a slow, quiet unraveling. A decision made in the dead of night, packed bags, and the realization that if she didn't leave now, she never would. So here she was, chasing the last of the daylight, heading toward a place she didn't quite know, feeling freer than she had in years. The road dipped, twisting through a dense pocket of forest, the trees stretching overhead in a tangled arch. The deeper she drove, the more the air seemed to change. The temperature dropped, the golden warmth of the setting sun giving way to something colder, something that slithered under her skin. A shiver ghosted down her spine. She shook it off, chalking it up to the shift in altitude. It was just the time of day, the way the light shifted, the loneliness of the road playing tricks on her mind. But still, the feeling remained a quiet hum of awareness just beneath the surface. Her fingers tapped absently against the steering wheel, a nervous rhythm. She turned on the radio, hoping for something. Anything to break the silence. But the station crackled, a garbled mess of static and faint voices, as though the signal couldn't quite reach these woods. Frowning, she reached forward and switched it off. The wind picked up. The trees trembled. Ahead, the sky darkened, clouds gathering on the horizon thick and heavy. A storm was coming. Aurora exhaled slowly, watching the first tendrils of mist creep across the road. She had driven through storms before. This was nothing. Still, something in her gut twisted. She pressed her foot a little harder on the gas, the car responding with a smooth hum, pushing forward. But the shadows stretched longer now. The trees closing in, the road narrowing as if it were guiding her into something deeper. And somewhere in the distance, hidden beneath the rising howl of the wind, something moved. Something watched. Aurora didn't see it, not yet. But soon she would. The first raindrop hit the windshield with a sharp tap. Then another. A slow, deliberate rhythm that turned erratic in a matter of seconds. Aurora cursed under her breath as the sky darkened to an almost bruised shade of grey, thick clouds rolling in like a slow, creeping tide. The golden hues of sunset disappeared entirely, swallowed by the kind of storm that didn't just arrive, it took over. The rain came hard, a sudden assault against glass and steel, the wipers struggling to keep up as she flipped them to their highest setting. The wind picked up, sending a shudder through the trees that lined the twisting road, their branches bending and groaning under the pressure. Lightning split the sky in a jagged streak of silver, illuminating the forest in a brief, eerie flash. Aurora's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, her earlier sense of freedom thinning beneath a rising unease. She'd driven through storms before, but this one was different. It wasn't just the rain or the wind, or even the low rumble of thunder that vibrated through her chest. It was the way the air felt thick, electric, charged with something she couldn't name. "Great," she muttered, flicking her headlights on as the road darkened. "Just what I needed." A few more miles, she told herself. Maybe 10. There had to be a gas station or a motel somewhere up ahead. Somewhere with a decent roof and hot coffee where she could wait this thing out. But the road stretched on, endless and empty, disappearing into sheets of rain. The wind howled again, this time with a voice, a sound too close to something human. Aurora's pulse gave an uneasy jump as she glanced at the rearview mirror, seeing nothing but water-streaked glass and the vague outlines of trees beyond. "Don't be ridiculous," she scolded herself. "The wind is just the wind." She swallowed against the lump in her throat and focused on the road. But even as she pressed forward, a coil of tension settled at the base of her spine. And then a flicker, just on the edge of her vision. A shape moving between the trees. Aurora's breath caught, her grip on the wheel going rigid. It was nothing. Probably a trick of the storm, the play of shadows and rain. "That's all." She exhaled shakily and leaned forward slightly, scanning the road ahead. The downpour thickened, each drop hitting with the force of a bullet, drowning out everything else. The car gave a sudden protesting lurch. Her heart shot into her throat as the engine coughed once. Then again. No, no, no. She eased her foot off the gas, but the car stuttered, the dashboard lights flickering before steadying again. She let out a breath, forcing her hands to steady on the wheel. Just the storm. Maybe she hit a bad patch of road or something. The car was old, reliable, sure, but not invincible. Still, her stomach twisted with something that felt too much like instinct, like warning. Ahead, the road curved sharply into a dense patch of forest, the trees forming a near impenetrable wall. The shadows were darker there, deeper, waiting. Aurora swallowed. Just a few more miles. Then she could stop. Then she could breathe. Lightning flashed again, and in the split second of illumination she saw it. A figure, standing, watching. And then gone. The car sputtered once. Twice. Then died. Aurora barely had time to register the silence before panic kicked in. "No, no, don't do this now!" Her voice was lost beneath the relentless drumming of rain on the hood. She turned the key, willing the engine to come back to life, but all she got in return was an empty, sputtering click. Dead! For a long second she sat there, hands still gripping the wheel, her breath coming faster. Outside, the storm howled, the trees bending in the furious wind, the sky dark and endless above. The headlights flickered once before cutting out completely, leaving her wrapped in shadow. A fresh bolt of lightning slashed across the sky, illuminating the road ahead in an eerie flash. Nothing but rain, pavement, and the looming outline of the forest. Alone, the realization settled in her gut, heavy and uncomfortable. She wasn't the panicky type. She'd driven through storms, gotten herself out of bad situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience or a bad luck moment. This felt like she'd taken a wrong turn onto the edge of something she didn't understand. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, forcing herself to think. She had a phone. She could call for help. Aurora pulled it from the passenger seat, her fingers fumbling with the screen, her heart lifting for a brief, hopeful second. No signal. Of course, she let out a humorless laugh, tossing it onto the dash, because why wouldn't it be? The rain thickened, coming in waves, the wind slicing through it like knives. If she stayed in the car, she'd be dry, but she wasn't exactly safe. The longer she sat here, the colder the air inside became, seeping through the thin material of her jacket. She needed to find shelter somewhere with a roof, a working phone, and preferably people. She glanced at the road behind her, barely visible through the downpour. No headlights. No signs of approaching cars. It was just her. Gritting her teeth, she reached for the handle and shoved the door open. The storm greeted her with a blast of icy wind, stealing the breath straight from her lungs. Cold, bitter, and unforgiving. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, stepping out onto the slick pavement. The rain drenched her instantly, clinging to her clothes, tangling in her hair. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the woods, the jagged edges of tree branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. She was miles from anything, with nothing but the whispering trees and the howling wind for company. Vulnerable. That word settled uncomfortably in her chest. She didn't like feeling vulnerable. But right now she was. A gust of wind shoved her forward, nearly making her slip on the wet asphalt. She steadied herself, planting her boots firmly before looking toward the forest again. The shadows pooled thickly between the trees, shifting, restless, then a flicker of movement. Aurora froze. Her pulse skittered, the air locking in her throat. It could have been the wind, the way the rain distorted her vision, the storm playing tricks on her. Or it could be something else. Something watching. Another flash of lightning burned across the sky, illuminating the trees in a harsh silver glow. And for the briefest of moments she swore she saw them. Eyes, luminous and golden, locked onto her from the darkness. Then the light vanished, the night swallowing them whole. The forest loomed before her, dark and unyielding. Aurora hesitated at the edge of the road, her breath coming in uneven bursts. Rain dripped from her hair, rolled down the curve of her spine beneath soaked clothes. The storm had swallowed the world whole, turning the road into a river, the sky into a churning mass of slate and fury. But standing here, with her useless car behind her and the whispering trees ahead, she knew she had no choice. Shelter. She needed to find shelter. Her fingers shook as she pulled her phone from her pocket, wiping the rain-slicked screen against her sleeve. The battery was down to 20%. No signal, just the dim, ghostly glow of the flashlight barely cutting through the storm. She swallowed. One step, then another. The first few strides off the road were tentative, her boots sinking slightly into the soft, rain-soaked earth. The trees reached for her, their bare branches curling in the wind like skeletal fingers. She adjusted her grip on the phone, its meager light flickering against the thick trunks, illuminating patches of slick moss and gnarled roots. She kept walking. The rain pounded around her, a steady, merciless rhythm. It mingled with the rustle of leaves, the groan of wind weaving through the trees like a living thing. Every step felt heavier, the forest closing in with each passing moment. Her heart was a drum in her chest, fast and unsteady. What the hell am I doing? She should have stayed in the car, waited for morning. Maybe someone would have come along. Maybe the storm would have passed, and she could have figured things out like a rational human being. But instinct had driven her forward. A deep, undeniable pull that whispered move, and so she had. Another gust of wind tore through the trees and she startled, her phone slipping from her fingers. The light tumbled end over end, landing face down in the mud, casting eerie, bouncing shadows through the underbrush. "Damn it," she muttered, crouching to retrieve it. When she straightened, a sound filtered through the rain. A rustle. A shift. Not the wind. Not the trees. Something else. Aurora's grip tightened around the phone. Her pulse stuttered, a cold shiver crawling along her spine. The beam of her flashlight darted across the trunks, searching. Nothing, just the wind, just the rain. She forced in a breath. Forced herself to take another step. The deeper she walked, the louder the storm seemed to get, but beneath it, she swore she could hear something else. A presence. Not footsteps exactly, but a sense of being followed, of eyes watching from the shadows just beyond her light's reach. The thought sent a prickle of fear down her arms. It was just the night, just the storm. Still, she quickened her pace. And the presence followed. The wind howled through the trees, wrapping around her like cold fingers. Rain dripped from the branches overhead, trickling in slow, icy streams down the back of Aurora's neck. She pushed forward, breath coming fast, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Something was out there. She wasn't just imagining it. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against her skin. A presence lingering at the edges of the storm. Not a figment of her mind. Not the wind or the twisting shadows. Something real. A flash of movement stopped her in her tracks. Aurora froze, her breath catching as her flashlight beam swept over the underbrush. Then she saw it. Emerging from the shifting dark, silent as a ghost, stood a wolf. Not just any wolf. It was massive, taller than any she had ever seen in a book or a documentary, its form cutting through the night with an elegance that was both unsettling and breathtaking. The fur, thick and dark as ink, glistened wetly beneath the storm's relentless assault. Muscles rippled beneath its sleek coat, the raw power of the creature evident even in stillness. But it was the eyes that held her captive. Luminous gold. Piercing. Intelligent in a way that sent something deep in her core trembling. The storm raged around them, but the wolf did not move, did not blink. Neither did she. Aurora's fingers curled instinctively around her phone, but her feet refused to back away. Any sane person would run, would at least scramble for a weapon, a branch, something to defend themselves. But the wolf didn't attack, didn't growl or bare its teeth. It simply stood there, watching her. The rain dripped from its muzzle, from the thick ruff of fur around its neck. And then, in a single, fluid motion, it turned. Aurora blinked. The wolf took a step, then another, moving with a grace that didn't belong to something of its size. It paused, glancing back over its shoulder, the movement almost expectant, as if it wanted her to follow. A cold shiver crawled up her spine, but it wasn't entirely fear this time. It was something else, something deeper, older. A knowing. "This is crazy," she whispered, the words lost to the wind. And yet her feet moved before her brain could argue. One step, then another. The wolf waited only long enough to ensure she was coming before it slipped forward, gliding effortlessly through the underbrush. It walked a narrow path she hadn't seen before, a near invisible break in the dense forest. She followed. What else could she do? Her flashlight bobbed with each step, illuminating the path just enough to keep from tripping. But her focus was on the wolf. The way it moved, soundless despite the wet leaves and fallen branches. The way it led without hesitation, as though it knew exactly where she needed to go. The wind shrieked overhead. The rain hammered down. But for the first time since she'd stepped off the road, she felt something other than fear. She felt safe. And she didn't know why. The wolf moved like a shadow through the storm, sure and sure, its dark form weaving between the trees, as though it had walked this path 1,000 times before. Aurora followed, her breath shallow, her soaked boots squelching against the mud. She didn't know why she trusted it. Logic told her she shouldn't. It was a wild animal, powerful and unpredictable. It could turn on her at any second. But something in her gut, something primal and deep, told her she was safe, so she kept going. The storm pressed in around them, the wind pushing at her back, howling through the trees like a living thing. Rain clung to every surface, dripping from branches, running in rivulets down the moss-covered trunks. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, fresh and wild, as though she had stepped into a place forgotten by time. Then, just ahead, the trees thinned, opening into a small clearing. The wolf stopped, its golden eyes gleaming as it turned back to her. Aurora's breath caught. There, at the heart of the clearing, half swallowed by creeping ivy and twisted roots, stood an old cabin. The structure leaned slightly, its wooden planks weathered by years of storms and solitude. The roof sagged in places, thick with moss, and the chimney was cracked, but somehow, impossibly, light flickered from inside. A faint, golden glow that barely cut through the rain, but was there all the same. Warmth. Shelter. Relief swept through her so fast she nearly swayed on her feet. The wolf took another step forward, then looked at her again. It was waiting. Aurora hesitated only a second before following. She mounted the small porch carefully, testing each board, half expecting them to give way beneath her weight. The door stood slightly ajar, its old hinges groaning as the wind shoved against it. She should have been afraid. She should have questioned how the cabin had a fire going, who had been here last, and why it felt like something was waiting for her inside. But exhaustion overrode her instincts. She stepped through the doorway, dripping water onto the dusty wooden floor. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged wood, damp fabric, and something faintly spiced something that whispered of warmth and familiarity. The room was small, rustic, but solid. A stone fireplace sat against one wall, a fire burning low within it. A thick wool blanket was draped over the back of an old armchair, and beyond that, a wooden table with a single oil lamp flickering weakly atop it. It felt untouched, preserved, as if time had paused within these walls, waiting for someone to return. She turned back toward the wolf. It stood just beyond the doorway, watching her with those piercing gold eyes. A shiver ran through her, not from the cold, not from fear, but from something else. Something deeper. "Thank you," she murmured. The wolf held her gaze for a long moment. Then, as though satisfied, it stepped back. Aurora's stomach twisted. Was it leaving? Before she could take a step toward it, before she could think to stop it, the wind surged again, slamming the door shut between them. The cabin trembled with the force of it. Thunder cracked like a whip across the sky. And Aurora, standing alone in the flickering firelight, realized the night still held more secrets. The fire crackled low in the stone hearth, its amber glow flickering against the rough wooden walls. The light danced in long shadows, stretching and shifting with each gust of wind that rattled the cabin's frame. Outside, the storm still raged, rain hammering against the roof, the wind howling through the trees like a chorus of unseen voices. Aurora sat on the floor near the fire, her legs tucked beneath her, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The heat from the flames seeped into her damp clothes, but the chill in her bones refused to fade. She was safe. For now. But she wasn't alone. Not really. Her gaze drifted to the door, the same door that had slammed shut, as if pushed by unseen hands. The same door that now separated her from the massive wolf that had led her here. The very wolf that had watched her. Not like prey. Not like a beast measuring its next meal. No, there had been something else in those eyes. Something sentient. She exhaled, pressing the heels of her palms against her temples. It was exhaustion. That was all. A long drive, a storm, getting stranded in the middle of nowhere. Her mind was making connections where there were none, but she couldn't shake the feeling. The way the wolf had found her led her here not through some random, instinctual act of nature, but with purpose. She lifted her gaze, studying the cabin around her. Dusk clung to the surfaces, the scent of damp wood and age settling thick in the air. Yet the fire burned. A heavy wool blanket lay folded over the arm of a chair, untouched but clean. Someone had been here. Recently. She was sitting in someone's home. The thought sent a prickle of unease down her spine. Aurora turned, scanning the single-room interior. A sturdy wooden table sat against the far wall, an old oil lamp perched on its edge. A small cot was tucked into the corner, its rough wool blanket pulled neatly over it, undisturbed. There were no personal belongings, no clothes, no scattered books or photographs. But still, someone had tended this place. Someone had prepared it. For her. She swallowed hard. No. That was ridiculous. And yet, the fire crackled again, the wood shifting, sending a fresh wave of warmth against her chilled skin. She hugged herself tighter. Maybe she was overthinking all of it. Maybe she was simply lucky. Maybe a thump sounded outside. Her breath caught, the hairs at the back of her neck lifting. She turned toward the door, her pulse skittering. The sound had been deep, solid, like something heavy shifting against the porch. The wind. The storm. Or something else? A shadow flickered across the window. She froze, heart slamming against her ribs. Something was out there, watching, waiting. The storm raged on. Aurora didn't remember falling asleep. One moment she'd been curled near the fire, staring into the flames, thoughts tangled in the impossible events of the night. The next she was waking to something low and guttural, a sound that slithered through the cabin's dim interior and set her heart hammering against her ribs. A growl, deep, primal. Her breath hitched, eyes snapping open as she pushed up onto her elbows. The fire had burned lower, its glow flickering weakly against the walls, deepening the shadows that pooled in the corners of the room. Wind screamed against the cabin, rain pelting the roof in furious waves. But none of that was what had woken her. It was him. The wolf. He stood just inside the doorway now, his dark fur slick with rain, his massive shoulders rising and falling with each breath. Golden eyes locked onto her, burning in the dimness like twin embers. He shouldn't have been able to open the door. It had been shut, sealed against the storm. But he was there, his presence consuming the space between them, filling it with something heavy, something electric. Aurora's pulse tripped. Then he moved. Not toward her, not away. Just shifted, and something in the air changed. It was subtle at first, barely a ripple. The scent of rain and earth, the crackling energy, the way his gaze never left hers. Then his body tensed, and she watched stunned, breathless as it began. The transformation. His bones stretched first, the shift of them audible, a deep, visceral sound that sent a shudder through her. Fur melted away in waves, absorbed by flesh that reformed in its place. Limbs lengthened, muscle reshaped, tendons pulled tight as his form twisted. The sound of it was unnatural, impossible. A symphony of movement and breaking, of something wild being reshaped into something else entirely. Human. Aurora pressed her back against the rough cabin wall, her breath strangled in her throat as the figure before her emerged from the wreckage of the wolf. Tall, broad-shouldered, powerfully built. His skin, where thick fur had once covered him, gleamed with the damp sheen of rain and sweat. His dark hair, nearly black, tumbled over his forehead in damp waves. A sharp jawline, a mouth set in something like pain or restraint. But it was the eyes that stole the air from her lungs, still golden, still burning. The same eyes that had watched her from the shadows of the forest. The same eyes that had led her here. A man now stood before her, shoulders rising and falling, his breath still ragged from the change. Aurora's body was locked in place, a riot of sensations warring within her: fear, wonder, disbelief, a pull so deep she swore she felt it in her bones. "This," she managed, voice barely a whisper. "This isn't possible." The man the wolf exhaled slowly, the weight of his gaze heavy on her skin. When he spoke, his voice was low, edged with something raw, something ancient. "It is." The single phrase sent a shiver racing through her. Outside, the wind howled, the storm screaming its fury into the night. But inside the cabin, everything had changed. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, the world had narrowed to two people. Aurora sat rigid, her back pressed against the rough wooden wall, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She could still hear the echo of bone shifting, the memory of fur melting into flesh. And now there was a man where a wolf had stood, a man with golden eyes that still burned in the dim firelight. He watched her, unmoving. She should have been terrified. Her mind screamed at her to be terrified. But fear tangled with something else, something she didn't understand. He took a step forward, slow, deliberate, like he was measuring the space between them. The air crackled with heat, as if something unseen and alive wove itself through the space between their bodies. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice low and measured. Aurora swallowed hard. She wanted to believe him. But how could she? She shook her head, unable to find the words. "You were a wolf," he finished for her. His lips curved, not quite a smile, not quite anything she could name. Yes, her stomach flipped. That's impossible. He tilted his head slightly, as if he found her words amusing. And yet, a fresh gust of wind battered the cabin, rattling the windows. The fire flickered, casting shifting shadows against his face. He was beautiful in a way that unsettled her, all sharp angles and quiet intensity, his body built for power. She forced herself to focus on the parts she could process. He was naked, mostly. He had pulled the thick wool blanket from the chair and wrapped it loosely around his waist. But his chest, bare and gleaming with the remnants of rain, revealed lean muscle and old scars. A fighter, then. A predator. She shivered, and his golden eyes darkened. You're cold. Cold was the least of her concerns. You need to start explaining, she said, forcing steel into her voice. Now, Ronan, because that name had surfaced in her mind as surely as if she had always known it, nodded, as though he'd been waiting for this. He moved slowly, lowering himself onto the chair by the fire, stretching his long legs in front of him with the ease of a man who belonged in his body, no matter what form it took. This place is safe, he said. For now, safe. The word should have comforted her, but it didn't. Nothing about this felt safe. Nothing about him did. She licked her lips. You brought me here. Yes, why? His gaze burned into hers, but when he spoke, his voice was steady, almost reverent. Because you are mine. A cold chill swept through her, not at the words themselves, but at the way something inside her, something deep, something primal, reacted to them. No, that was insane. She shoved away the feeling, forced her voice not to tremble. Excuse me. His expression remained calm, but there was something in his eyes now, something old, something certain. You are my mate, Aurora. You were always meant to be. She let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. You can't be serious. But he didn't flinch, didn't falter. There is a prophecy, he said, as if that explained everything. A bond written before either of us drew breath. A thread woven through time, binding us together. It is fate, Aurora. It is truth. She shook her head. No, that's ridiculous. I don't even know you. His lips parted slightly, a breath of something like amusement escaping. You will. Aurora pressed a hand to her temple. This is crazy. I don't even know what this is. Ronan remained still, but she felt the weight of him, the way his presence filled every inch of the space between them. There are things in this world beyond what you know, he said, his voice like smooth gravel, deep and unshakable. Things hidden. You stepped into them the moment you left the road, or maybe they stepped into you. Her heart hammered. Why me? His gaze softened just a fraction. Because you are meant for me, just as I am meant for you. The fire crackled. The storm raged. Aurora swallowed hard. The words shouldn't have touched something inside her. They shouldn't have meant anything, but they did, and that terrified her more than anything else. Act 2, Prophecy and Dilemma. Aurora woke to silence. Not the eerie, suffocating kind that pressed against your ears like a held breath. No, this was the silence of dawn, the world hushed and waiting, as if the storm had stolen every sound and left only stillness in its wake. She blinked against the dim light filtering through the broken window, soft and golden, dust motes swirling lazily in the cool morning air. For a moment she lay there, her body cocooned in the warmth of the wool blanket. She barely remembered pulling over herself. Then it hit her. The storm. The wolf. Him. Her breath caught as reality settled like a weight on her chest. Slowly she turned her head, gaze sweeping the small, time-worn cabin. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, the room bathed in muted light. The scent of damp earth and charred wood lingered, mixing with something else, something distinctly male. Her eyes found him instantly. Ronan. He was standing by the fireplace, one hand braced against the stone mantel, his broad, bare shoulders illuminated by the rising sun. The blanket he'd wrapped around himself last night was gone, replaced by dark, weathered jeans that hung low on his hips. He was looking out the window, unmoving, his expression unreadable, human. And yet not. Her stomach twisted. The memories of the night before clawed their way back his transformation, his impossible words. "You are my mate. You were always meant to be." Aurora pressed a hand to her forehead. God, she must have lost her mind. But that was the problem, wasn't it? It had happened. Every last impossible piece of it. She had followed a wolf through a storm, into an abandoned cabin, only to watch him turn into a man with golden eyes that stripped her bare. And somehow, that wasn't even the strangest part. It was the way she had felt when he spoke those words. The way something inside her had reacted not with fear, but recognition. She shoved the thought away. No. That was his truth, not hers. And yet, her fingers curled into the blanket, gripping it like an anchor as she tried to make sense of everything. She should be running, screaming, doing something other than sitting here, feeling things she had no business feeling. Instead, she swallowed hard and asked the question that had been clawing at her since last night. "What are you?" Ronan didn't turn right away. For a long moment he just stood there, the golden light casting sharp lines across his jaw, the curve of his shoulders. Then, slowly, deliberately, he shifted his gaze to hers. "Something that was never meant to exist," he said quietly. A shiver ghosted down her spine, but she didn't look away. She wasn't sure she ever could. The scent of wood smoke and something faintly charred drifted through the cabin as Aurora sat across from Ronan at the small wooden table. The fire in the hearth had been rekindled, filling the space with warmth that didn't quite reach the tension between them. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was simple dried meat, rough bread, and water from an old clay jug Ronan had pulled from a storage chest. It should have been awful, but Aurora barely tasted it. Her stomach was too tangled in knots. She picked at the bread, her gaze locked on the man across from her. A man who had been a wolf only hours before. Ronan sat comfortably, his golden eyes calm but watchful. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his place in the world, as if nothing about last night or this morning had unsettled him. "That made one of them. You said it was fate," she started, the words stiff on her tongue. "That I was, meant for you." His gaze didn't waver. "You are." Aurora exhaled sharply, pushing her plate away. "Okay, see, that's not how this works. You don't just declare someone your mate like we're in some kind of ancient myth." Something flickered in his expression. "But we are," she scoffed. "No, we are two people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time." Ronan didn't react to her bite. He simply leaned back slightly, as though he had expected this argument. "You are human. Your kind has forgotten the old ways, but my kind has not, his kind." Aurora crossed her arms, forcing herself to hold his gaze even as her pulse kicked up. "Then explain it to me." He studied her for a long moment, as if deciding how much truth she could handle. Then, in that same measured voice, he said, "We are the blood of the first." A shiver ghosted over her skin. The first. Ronan's gaze held steady, but there was something distant in it now, as though he were reaching beyond time itself. The beginning was not of men, nor of wolves, but of something in between. The first were not born, but created, touched by the moon's power, their blood forever changed. They were neither fully man nor fully beast, but something more, guardians, rulers of the night, bound to the rhythm of the stars. His voice was steady, low, a cadence that felt older than him, older than the cabin, older than the storm outside. Aurora's breath caught as something shifted in the air, as if the past itself was bleeding into the present. But with power came a price, he continued. They were never meant to walk alone. To survive, to thrive, the first were given mates soul-bound, fated, connected beyond reason or will. Without them they grew weak, lost. But together they were whole. Stronger. His fingers curled against the worn wooden table. That bond still runs through us. Through me. And now through you. Aurora swallowed against the lump in her throat. No. He tilted his head slightly, but there was no anger in his expression, just understanding. You feel it. She did. And that terrified her. Aurora pushed back from the table, standing so fast the chair scraped against the floor. "This is insane." Ronan stayed seated, but there was a quiet patience in the way he watched her. "I don't believe in fate," she snapped. "I don't believe in any of this." He finally moved then, standing slowly, the sheer presence of him filling the space between them. His bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor as he stepped toward her, deliberate, measured, but never threatening. "Belief doesn't change what is," he said softly. Aurora clenched her fists, fighting the way her body reacted to the deep, velvety timbre of his voice. She shook her head, forcing herself to breathe. "You're saying I don't have a choice." For the first time, his expression flickered. Not with anger, not with frustration, but something softer. "You always have a choice, Mograd." His voice was nearly a whisper now, and though she didn't know the language, the words curled around her like warmth, like something meant only for her. "But fate will not be denied." The storm outside had passed, but inside, something far more powerful had just begun. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, charged with the weight of things too big to name. Aurora stood stiffly, arms crossed over her chest, her breath coming too fast. Ronan, in contrast, remained still, composed, watching her with those golden eyes that saw too much. She hated that he was patient, that he wasn't pressing her, wasn't demanding she accept this insanity. Because that meant the decision was hers to make. She wasn't ready for that. She wasn't ready for any of this. But even as the logical part of her screamed for her to walk away, to leave this cabin, this man, in the rearview mirror of her life, something deeper whispered a different truth. She couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not when her skin still burned with the memory of his words. Not when something inside her, the part of herself she had never fully understood, the part that had always felt like it was waiting, stirred at the sound of his voice. She didn't believe in fate, but she couldn't deny that she had felt him before she had ever seen him. With a shaky breath, she dropped her arms to her sides. "Okay." Ronan's head tilted slightly. "Okay." Aurora's stomach tightened. "Okay, I'll hear you out. I'll see this place you're talking about. But that doesn't mean I'm agreeing to any of this fated mate nonsense." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips, but he didn't argue. Fair enough. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. "And if I decide to leave?" Something flickered behind his eyes, something old, something unreadable. "Then you leave." It should have reassured her. Instead, it only made her more uneasy. Because even though he said it, even though he gave her the choice, she felt the weight of inevitability settling over her. She could leave. But could she really walk away? Before she could dwell on the thought, Ronan turned toward the door, his movement fluid, controlled. He grabbed a shirt from the back of a chair and pulled it on, the fabric stretching across his broad shoulders before he turned back to her. "There's something you need to see." His voice was quiet, but it hummed with an unshakable certainty. Aurora hesitated, every rational thought screaming at her to say no, to stay here, to cling to the version of reality she had known before last night. But that version was already crumbling. She swallowed, then nodded. Ronan didn't gloat, didn't press. He only stepped aside, giving her space to move past him. She reached for the door, her fingers grazing the rough wood, hesitating for a fraction of a second before pushing it open. The morning light spilled into the cabin, soft and golden, brushing against her skin with the first warmth she had felt in hours. She stepped over the threshold, and just like that, she was no longer the woman she had been yesterday. She was something else, something new. And whatever waited for her in the depths of the forest, whatever secrets Ronan was about to reveal, she wasn't sure she wanted to run from it anymore. The forest stretched around them, vast and ancient, a world untouched by time. Aurora followed Ronan down a path that barely existed, a narrow strip of earth woven between towering trees, their thick canopies filtering the sunlight into golden shards. The storm from the night before had left the ground damp, the scent of wet earth and pine saturating the air. Mist clung to the underbrush, curling at her ankles like spectral fingers. She tightened her grip on the strap of her bag. I'm starting to think you're leading me to some secret fairy tale kingdom. Ronan glanced back at her, his lips curving slightly. Not a fairy tale. But secret. Yes, the amusement in his voice only made her more aware of how little she understood this world he was bringing her into. She should be afraid any rational person would be, but she wasn't. Not entirely. Curiosity tangled with caution, with something deeper she refused to name. She focused on her surroundings instead. The further they walked, the more the forest changed. It was subtle at first, the way the trees seemed closer together, their trunks thick with moss, the way the air hummed with something unseen, something alive. Then she noticed the silence. The usual sounds of the woods, the distant call of birds, the rustling of squirrels through the leaves had faded. The only noise was the rhythmic crunch of their footsteps against the damp earth and the occasional whisper of wind stirring the branches above. It wasn't eerie, though. It was expectant, as if the forest itself was watching. Aurora shivered, resisting the urge to glance over her shoulder. "Tell me I'm imagining it. You're not." Ronan's voice was steady, but there was something beneath it. Something reverent. He pushed aside a tangle of low-hanging branches, revealing a break in the trees ahead. "We're here." Aurora stepped beside him and felt her breath catch. The world before her shifted. What had once been an endless stretch of wilderness opened into something else entirely. A village. Hidden. Nestled within the thick of the forest, as if it had grown from the earth itself. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. Aurora had expected something small. Primitive, maybe. A scattering of cabins. The kind of rustic living one might find in the depths of the mountains. But this was something out of time. The village sprawled in levels built into the land as if it had always been there. Stone cottages with thick, ivy-covered walls stood in clusters, their windows glowing faintly with candlelight. Narrow cobbled paths twisted between them, winding up gentle slopes and disappearing into the mist-draped trees. And the people, they moved with a quiet grace, their presence as natural as the landscape itself. Some walked in pairs, their voices hushed in a language she didn't recognize. Others worked in the open spaces splitting wood, carrying bundles of herbs, stirring something in a massive iron cauldron that sent tendrils of steam curling into the air. Aurora inhaled, and the scent of wood smoke, damp leaves, and something faintly spiced filled her lungs. It felt old, sacred. A place that had existed long before she was born, and would remain long after she was gone. "Welcome to the enclave," Ronan said beside her. She turned to him, studying the way he stood there, shoulders squared, jaw set. This wasn't just a place to him. It was home. Her heart gave a slow, uncertain beat. Somewhere deep inside her, something shifted. She wasn't sure if she was stepping into a new world or if she had been meant to find it all along. Aurora felt their eyes on her before she even stepped through the doorway. The weight of their stares pressed against her skin, silent but heavy, 1,000 unspoken questions strung between them. Some faces were unreadable, others filled with quiet curiosity, but a few were openly wary, their gazes cool and assessing. She wasn't welcome here. Not yet. Ronan walked beside her, his presence solid and steady, his broad shoulders cutting through the tension like a blade. He didn't say a word, but he didn't need to. The way he positioned himself just slightly ahead of her, just enough to remind them who had brought her here, said everything. They reached what looked like the heart of the village, a long, low building constructed of thick stone and weathered beams. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the scent of roasted meat and something herbal hung in the air. Inside, the warmth was immediate, thick with firelight and murmuring voices. A communal hall. The ceiling stretched high, supported by ancient beams, the walls lined with long wooden tables and benches. At the far end, a raised platform held a semicircle of chairs, occupied by the ones she knew were important before they even spoke. The elders. She could feel their authority, woven into the very air of the space, into the way the others moved with instinctual respect. Ronan stopped at the center of the room, waiting. The silence stretched, a quiet undercurrent of anticipation buzzing beneath it. Then one of the elders spoke. "This is the human." Aurora's spine stiffened. The voice came from a man with iron-grey hair and sharp blue eyes, his gaze cutting through her like a blade. He was older, his features carved with years of experience, but nothing about him felt frail. No, this was a man who had seen battles and won them. Ronan met his gaze without flinching. "This is Aurora." The murmurs started again, hushed conversations slipping through the space, too quiet for her to catch. Aurora clenched her hands into fists, willing herself to hold steady. She had faced boardroom meetings full of men who thought of med. He had stared down bosses who doubted her ability, had walked away from a life that no longer fit. She wouldn't crumble now. A woman on the elder's platform leaned forward, her dark eyes sharp, assessing. Unlike the first man, there was something in her gaze that wasn't hostile, just curious. "She is human," the woman said, her voice smoother, more measured. "You bring her here as what, Ronan?" "A guest?" Ronan's jaw tensed. "As my mate." The words settled like a stone in the center of the room. Silence. "Then she is not of us." This came from another elder, younger than the others, his expression twisted in something close to disdain. "She will be," Ronan said simply. The murmurs turned to full conversations now, tension thickening, the weight of the room pressing against Aurora's ribs. She wasn't sure which was worse, their skepticism or the fact that a few of them looked at her with something else entirely. Hope, as if she were a sign. As if she were meant to be here. Aurora took a breath, her pulse loud in her ears. She had been in rooms like this before, the outsider, the anomaly. But this time was different. This time she wasn't alone. Ronan shifted slightly, his stance easy, but there was nothing relaxed about him. His presence was protective, his attention locked onto the elders, unwavering. "We will speak," the iron-haired man said at last, his tone final. Ronan nodded once, then turned to Aurora. She followed him out. The weight of the pack's judgment still coiled around her, thick as smoke. As the door closed behind them, she caught the tail end of a whispered conversation between two elders. She could be the change we feared, or the end of everything. The words sent a shiver down her spine. She had just stepped into something bigger than she understood. And there was no turning back now. Aurora had spent her life in a world of logic, schedules and deadlines, bills and grocery lists. A world where things made sense, where magic belonged in fairy tales and myths, where fate was just a word people used to explain things they couldn't control. And now she was here, in a village that shouldn't exist. Among people who weren't entirely people. Her world had been rewritten overnight, and no matter how much she tried to hold on to reason, to logic, nothing about this place fit into the rules she had always known. She adjusted the strap of the leather satchel one of the women had given her a gift, apparently so she could carry what she needed. The gesture had been kind, even if the woman hadn't spoken more than 2 words to her. Most of them hadn't. The pack watched her, but they kept their distance. Not outright hostility, not anymore, but caution. As if they were waiting to see what she would become. Aurora walked along the winding stone path that cut through the village, her boots scuffing lightly against the damp earth. Around her, life moved in a rhythm that felt ancient and effortless. Children darting between cottages, their laughter bright and unrestrained, while men and women worked in practice synchronicity, carrying bundles of wood, stirring enormous iron pots over open fires. She had expected something primal, something out of the past, and in some ways it was. There was no electricity, no cars, no modern convenience in sight. And yet, this place wasn't primitive. It was deliberate. Every structure, every movement, every glance exchanged between pack members was done with purpose. A way of life, not a struggle for survival. It was unsettling and fascinating. She had spent years chasing stories, seeking out experiences beyond the dull repetition of everyday life. She had wanted adventure. To see more, to feel more. Well, she'd gotten her wish. A group of women stood near the communal fire, their hands busy weaving thick, sturdy fabrics together, the scent of herbs drifting from bundles tied nearby. One of them, a woman with long, ink-dark hair and warm brown eyes, lifted her head, catching Aurora's gaze. Aurora hesitated. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she took a step closer. The women fell silent, their hands stilling. Aurora swallowed. I just wanted to see what you were making." A long beat of silence stretched between them. Then, the dark-haired woman nodded once, tilting her chin toward the unfinished length of woven cloth. "For the winter," she said simply. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her tone, a test maybe. Aurora nodded. "It's beautiful." The woman studied her, then her fingers resumed their work, the others following suit. No further words were spoken, but the tension in the air eased just a fraction. Aurora exhaled and stepped back, letting them return to their rhythm. Progress. Not much, but something. She continued down the path, her thoughts a tangled mess. She wasn't one of them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She was human in a world of wolves, an outsider in a place built on blood and loyalty. And yet, somewhere deep inside her, a voice whispered that this place, this life, wasn't as foreign as she wanted it to be. That maybe it had been waiting for her all along. The council hall was dimly lit, the glow of fire casting long shadows against the stone walls. The elders sat in a semicircle, their expressions ranging from concern to something colder, something that edged too close to resentment. Ronan stood before them, his stance unshaken, unreadable. It was Jarek, the eldest of them all, who spoke first. His iron-grey hair caught the light as he folded his hands in front of him. "This is a mistake." Ronan's jaw tensed. "It's fate." Jarek's gaze sharpened. "Or it's a threat disguised as one." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Another elder, Marisol, leaned forward, her dark eyes calculating. "We have followed tradition for generations. A human has never been chosen." Ronan's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "And yet she has been." A murmur rippled through the group, some voices hushed, others louder. Jarek's lips pressed into a thin line. "And if she is not truly meant for you, if this is nothing more than a mistake of fate?" A sharp breath, then Callum, one of the younger elders, interjected. "Or worse, if she is a danger to us." Ronan's body went rigid. "She is not a danger." Jarek sighed, weary but firm. "Perhaps not now. But she is an outsider, and outsiders bring change." His eyes darkened, "and change brings war." A hush fell over the room. Ronan exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. "Aurora is here. She is part of this now. And she will not be cast aside." Marisol tilted her head. "You would risk everything for a human." Ronan's gaze burned. "I would risk everything for my mate." Silence. A storm was brewing here, one of whispers of doubt, of fear. And just outside the door, pressed against the rough wood, Aurora heard every word. Her breath stilled in her lungs, her pulse hammering in her throat. They didn't trust her. Some of them didn't even want her alive. She had stepped into a world where she wasn't just knew she was dangerous, and if she wasn't careful, she might not survive it. The forest was a world of silver and shadow beneath the full moon. Aurora walked beside Ronan, her boots silent against the soft earth, the scent of damp leaves and pine thick in the cool night air. The village was far behind them now, the glow of firelight lost to the trees. Here it was only the two of them, the night stretching endless above, the sky cut with stars too bright, too sharp to be real. The moonlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting a luminescent glow over the narrow path, painting everything in shades of ivory and onyx. It clung to Ronan's skin, highlighting the sharp angles of his face, the carved strength of his jaw. He moved like the night belonged to him, his strides easy, controlled. As if he was the forest, as if the wild recognized him as its own. And maybe it did. Aurora exhaled slowly, wrapping her arms around herself as the night wind whispered through the branches. "Why bring me out here?" she asked. her voice softer than she intended, as though speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile thing had settled between them. Ronan glanced at her, the gold of his irises brighter in the moonlight, because you needed a moment to breathe. She let out a quiet laugh. "And how would you know what I need?" His lips quirked. "I just do." It should have annoyed her, the quiet confidence, the way he knew her without explanation. But instead, it unsettled her in a different way, something low in her stomach curling at the way his voice wrapped around the words. They walked in silence for a while, the sounds of the forest filling the space between them, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl, the sighing of the wind through the towering trees. It should have felt isolating. Instead, it felt safe, as if there was nowhere else in the world she was supposed to be. Finally, Ronan spoke again. "I was 12 the first time I shifted." Aurora looked at him, surprised at the sudden shift in conversation. He kept his gaze forward, his expression unreadable. "It was late autumn. My father had taken me deep into the mountains, said it was time. I remember thinking I wasn't ready." "A breath. But the moon doesn't wait for you to be ready." She swallowed, sensing the weight behind his words. "Did it hurt?" His mouth curved slightly, but there was no humor in it. "Yes." A shiver traced down her spine. He turned to her then, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. "Our kind is born into this. But that doesn't mean it isn't painful. It doesn't mean it doesn't change you." Aurora's fingers tightened around her arms. "And now you think I'm changing too." Ronan didn't look away. "You already have." Her pulse jumped, a quiet war waging inside her. She wanted to deny it, to insist she was still the same woman who had been stranded in the storm, but she wasn't. She could feel it. In the way her body responded to this place, to him. She let out a slow, unsteady breath. "I don't know how to be part of this world." Ronan took a step closer, his presence wrapping around her like the night itself. "You don't have to figure it out alone." Something about the way he said it, the quiet promise laced in his voice, made the knot in her chest loosen. And for the first time since she had arrived in the enclave, she wasn't sure she wanted to fight it. The path opened into a small clearing, a quiet space where the trees parted just enough for the moon to spill freely over the earth. Aurora stopped, tilting her head back, letting the silver light brush against her skin. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Ronan watched her, his gaze unwavering. "Yes." She looked at him then, something in her chest tightening at the way he said it, as if he wasn't speaking about the moon at all. A breathless silence stretched between them. He was too close, or maybe she wasn't far enough. The cool night air did nothing to stop the slow heat curling through her, the awareness that prickled at her skin, that made her fingers twitch at her sides. He reached out, slow, deliberate, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His knuckles grazed her cheek, a feather-light touch, barely there but it sent a shiver through her, a sharp contrast to the chill of the night. Her pulse kicked up, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs. Aurora knew she should step back, break whatever spell had settled over them. But she didn't. Instead, she tilted her face into his touch, just slightly, just enough to feel him. Ronan's eyes darkened, the golden hue burning deeper, brighter. "You feel it too," he murmured. She swallowed, her heart pounding so loud she swore he could hear it. Yes, God help her, yes, she felt it. The pull, the impossible magnetism of it, the bond. Aurora's fingers curled, the need to touch him, to hold onto something solid, nearly unbearable. And that's what terrified her the most. Not that he was different. Not that she was standing in the middle of a world she didn't understand. But that she didn't want to run. She wanted to stay. Her throat tightened, panic warring with longing. Ronan's gaze never left hers, his touch still soft, as if he knew exactly how fragile the moment was. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. Aurora's breath shuddered. She knew she should. She should tell him to stop, to step away, to leave this fire between them to burn itself out before it consumed her whole. But when she opened her mouth, no words came. And Ronan smiled. The night air was still charged when they returned to the village. Aurora felt the weight of her own emotions pressing against her ribs, the warmth of Ronan's touch lingering on her skin like a phantom sensation. She hadn't spoken since he'd pulled away, since the intensity of what had just happened settled between them like something fragile and unspoken. But whatever quiet moment they had claimed in the moonlit clearing was gone the moment they stepped back into the enclave. The tension hit her first sharp, electric waiting. Then the voices, raised, angry, barely contained. The village's main clearing was no longer quiet. A group had gathered near the council hall, figures clustered in tight groups, their postures rigid. Conversations halted the moment Ronan and Aurora stepped into view, all eyes snapping toward them. And then him. A man stepped forward from the crowd, his expression carved from ice, his presence radiating something that set every nerve in Aurora's body on edge. Tall, lean muscle wrapped in barely restrained fury, Kieran moved like he was already spoiling for a fight. His dark hair was cropped short, his features sharp and predatory, but it was his eyes that held the most danger dark with something bitter, something that had been simmering long before tonight. Ronan exhaled, slow and measured. Not now. Kieran's mouth curved, but it wasn't a smile. "Oh, I think now is perfect." Aurora's pulse skittered, but she didn't move. The pack wasn't just watching anymore. They were waiting. For the fight. For the answer. For the fallout. Kieran's gaze flicked to her for a fraction of a second before returning to Ronan. "You really did it, didn't you?" His voice was silk wrapped around steel. "You brought a human into our home." Aurora felt the words hit like a blow, but she refused to react. Ronan's body was a wall beside her, unmoving, unshaken. "I did." Kieran's expression darkened, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. "You always did think you were above the rest of us." "This isn't about me?" "No," Kieran laughed, but it was a sharp, humorless thing. "You expect us to believe that? That this," he gestured toward Aurora, "isn't about you? That it isn't about you thinking you can change the rules just because you don't like them?" Aurora stiffened. This wasn't just about her. This was about him. About things that had festered between them long before she ever stepped into this world. Ronan's jaw tightened. "I expect you to trust that I know what's right for the pack." Kieran's eyes burned. "You don't get to decide that alone." The tension was suffocating now, pressing against every inch of the space between them. The others were still watching, listening, but no one stepped in. Aurora felt it then, the division. Some of them were with Ronan. Some of them weren't. And some were just waiting to see which way the wind would shift before choosing a side. Kieran took another step closer, his voice quieter now, more dangerous. "You're asking us to trust something we don't understand. Something that has never happened before." His gaze cut to Aurora, sharp and unyielding. "And for what?" Ronan's response was instant, feral. For her. The words rang through the clearing, final and unshakable. Aurora's breath caught. Kieran's expression didn't change, but something in his stance did. A beat of silence stretched between them, thick with undeniable truth. Then, with a slow exhale, Kieran shook his head. "I hope, for all of our sakes, that you're right." The warning lingered long after the crowd began to disperse, long after Kieran turned and walked away, long after Aurora realized this fight was far from over. Act 3. Echoes of Danger. The air inside the council hall was thick with tension, the kind that clung to skin and sank into bones. Firelight flickered against the rough stone walls, casting jagged shadows that danced across the somber faces of the elders. The scent of burning wood and something older, something earthy, lingered in the air, as if the room itself held its breath. Aurora wasn't supposed to be here. She knew that. She stood in the narrow hallway just outside the chamber, pressed against the rough wooden beams, listening as the conversation unfolded on the other side of the heavy door. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the sharp edge in Ronan's voice had stopped her in her tracks, had held her there, curiosity battling with the unsettling feeling in her gut. "There have been reports," Jarek said, his voice like gravel grinding against steel. "Scouts have seen movement beyond the western ridge." "It could be nothing." A pause. "Or it could be them." A murmur rippled through the room. Aurora frowned. "Them? We don't assume anything," Ronan said, his tone clipped, controlled. "Not when it comes to the Fenrir clan." A silence heavy and loaded. The name sent a prickle of unease down her spine. She had never heard it before, but the way it settled in the space between the pack's leaders like an unspoken curse made her stomach twist. "Fenrir has been waiting for an opening," Callum said, his voice quieter, but no less dangerous. "If they sense weakness, they'll take it. We have held our borders for generations," Jarek countered. "They know better than to push us." But things have changed. Marisol's voice, smooth as silk but sharp as a blade, cut through the air. "Our pack is already on edge, divided. And now, with her here," Aurora stiffened. They meant her. She curled her fingers into her palms, her heart hammering. "Let them come." Ronan's voice was low, lethal. "They'll learn soon enough that this pack is not broken." A beat of silence. Then Jarek sighed. "We need more information. I'll send another scouting party at dawn." Ronan didn't respond right away, and for a moment Aurora thought the meeting was over. Then he spoke, softer this time, but with the kind of certainty that sent chills over her skin. "They won't wait until dawn." Aurora pressed her back harder against the wall, her breath shallow. Ronan was right. Something was already coming. The first sign was the silence. One moment the forest was alive, the wind rustling through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the low murmur of voices as Ronan and a few of the others patrolled the outer edge of the village. The next, the night held its breath. Aurora felt it before she saw it, a shift in the air, a presence. Then the attack came like a blade slicing through the dark. Shadows burst from the trees, bodies moving too fast, too silent, cutting through the moonlight like living weapons. Growls tore through the clearing, the dull thud of impact as bodies collided, the sharp clang of steel against steel. Aurora's breath seized. This was real. Ronan was already in motion, shifting mid-air, his form stretching, twisting, until his wolf landed in the dirt with a bone-rattling snarl. Claws met flesh, jaws snapped, the scent of blood laced the cold night air. She should run. She should hide. But she couldn't. She wasn't a fighter. She wasn't one of them. And yet her pack was under attack. A figure lunged at her from the left, a blur of movement, the glint of a blade catching moonlight. Aurora didn't think. She moved, ducking low, her instincts screaming. Her hand found a fallen branch, thick, solid, and she swung. The impact jarred her arms, sent a vibration through her bones, but the attacker stumbled, caught off guard. Adrenaline roared through her, white-hot, transformative. She wasn't the same woman who had stumbled into this world, lost and afraid. She wouldn't be a liability. She wouldn't let them fight alone. Ronan was there in an instant, his massive wolf form slamming into the attacker, sending them sprawling. His golden eyes locked onto hers for a brief second, assessing, searching, but she wasn't broken. "Not anymore." She nodded, breathless. "I'm okay." And then the fight raged on. The attackers were fast, but the pack was faster. Teeth flashed, claws raked, bodies hit the ground. The sounds of battle filled the night, but Aurora wasn't frozen anymore. She saw a blade glint, caught the movement behind Talia, and without thinking, she acted. She threw herself forward, knocking the enemy off balance before the strike could land. They tumbled together, limbs tangled, and the impact knocked the breath from her lungs. Pain exploded in her shoulder, but she didn't let go. Didn't stop. She fought. When it was over, when the last enemy fell, and the night was once again still, Aurora stood, her chest heaving, her fingers slick with sweat and dirt. Ronan shifted back, his breathing ragged, his expression unreadable as he crossed the space between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, he reached out. Aurora let him Let his fingers brush against her wrist. Let the warmth of his skin ground her. "You fought," he murmured. She exhaled shakily. "Yeah." A slow nod. A flicker of something in his gaze respect. "They won't stop," he said, his voice low. "Not now." Aurora swallowed hard. No, they wouldn't. But neither would she. The battle had ended, but the night still felt heavy with its echoes. Aurora stood in the village clearing, the scent of blood and damp earth thick in the air. The fires still burned, their flickering glow casting jagged shadows against the trees. Smoke curled in thin tendrils, mixing with the crisp bite of pine and the metallic tang of war. Bodies had been carried away, both theirs and the enemy's. She exhaled, slow and controlled, watching as pack members moved around her. Some were tending wounds, others standing in tight clusters, voices hushed and tense. Relief clashed with exhaustion, but beneath it all, something darker simmered, fear. Not for the battle they had just fought, but for the war that had yet to come. Aurora swallowed against the dryness in her throat. She wasn't used to this, the weight of aftermath, the way death hung in the air like an unspoken vow. In her old life, violence was something distant, something that happened in the pages of newspapers or late-night news reports. Now she had felt it, had fought in it, and she still wasn't sure what that meant. A figure moved beside her, and she looked up to find Talia, her sharp brown eyes filled with something unreadable. "You did well," Talia said simply. "No exaggeration, no unnecessary words. Just truth." Aurora forced a breath. "I don't even know what I did." Talia gave her a look, something almost amused, but mostly knowing. "You stood your ground." Aurora let out a short, shaky laugh. "Not much of a plan." "No," Talia agreed, but it was enough. A flicker of warmth bloomed in Aurora's chest, unexpected but welcome. She had fought, and they had seen her. Not as an outsider, not as a human among wolves, but as one of them. She wasn't sure when Ronan appeared, but suddenly he was there, standing at the edge of the firelight, watching her. Her breath caught not from fear, never from fear, but because something had shifted between them. She had felt it in the battle, in the way he had moved toward her without hesitation, in the way his gaze had locked onto hers with something fierce and unyielding. And now, in the silence of the aftermath, it felt even stronger. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate, the golden glow of his eyes softer now, but no less intense. "You're hurt." She glanced down at the shallow scrape on her shoulder, dried blood staining the torn fabric of her sleeve. "Barely." His jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he exhaled, dragging a hand through his dark hair. "You shouldn't have been out there," he murmured, his voice low. "Not yet." A flicker of stubbornness flared inside her. "I couldn't just stand back and watch." Something in his expression shifted, not anger, not disappointment. Something closer to understanding. He reached out, slow and careful, his fingers brushing against her wrist. The touch was barely there, but she felt it everywhere. "You fought for them," he said quietly. She swallowed. "I fought for us." His breath hitched, his fingers tightening around hers just slightly, as if testing something neither of them could name. The fire crackled, the wind whispering through the trees, and for a moment there was only them, a breath of stillness in a world that had been anything but. Ronan's thumb traced absently over her knuckles, and she shivered, but she didn't pull away. Something was happening, something inevitable, and for once she didn't want to run from it. She met his gaze, heart hammering. "They won't stop coming, will they?" Ronan's expression darkened, the gold in his eyes burning low, like embers waiting to ignite. "No," he murmured. This was just the beginning. Aurora knew that. She had felt it in the fight, in the way the enemy moved not just with violence, but with purpose. And yet, standing here with him, she realized something else. She wasn't afraid, because no matter what came next, she wouldn't be facing it alone. The night was too still. A deceptive, uneasy calm hung over the village, stretching long and taut like a bowstring pulled to its limit. The full moon loomed above, casting everything in its silver glow too bright, too knowing, too expectant. It painted the trees in pale luminescence, made the shadows seem deeper, sharper. The pack felt it. A storm on the horizon. They moved in near silence, their preparations efficient, their gazes locked and steady. No words were needed. Every step, every breath carried the same truth tonight. Everything would change. Aurora stood on the edge of the clearing, arms wrapped around herself against the cold bite of anticipation. The wind whispered through the towering pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and something darker beneath it. She exhaled, watching as Ronan stood by the main fire, speaking in hushed tones with the pack's warriors. He was a force among them, his presence undeniable. Dressed in dark leathers, his broad shoulders rigid with tension, he commanded attention with nothing more than the quiet, steady certainty in his stance. But when he turned, when his golden gaze found hers, something in his expression shifted just for a moment. A flicker of something raw. Something meant only for her. She didn't move as he approached, his steps slow but deliberate. "You should stay back when it begins," he said, voice low. Aurora clenched her fists. "We both know that's not happening." His jaw tightened. "Aurora, no," she cut in, lifting her chin. "Don't tell me to run. Not after everything." His gaze burned into hers, filled with conflict, with something deeper. "If something happens to you, then it happens." She inhaled sharply, forcing him to see the truth in her eyes. "I choose this, Ronan. I choose to stand with you." A muscle ticked in his jaw. Then, before she could react, he reached out. His fingers curled around the back of her neck, his warmth sinking into her skin, and he pulled her close, not for a kiss, not for anything sweet or careful, just to breathe her in, to feel her heartbeat, to know she was still here. "I won't lose you," he murmured. Aurora swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. "Then don't." They stood like that for a long moment, the world narrowing down to just them. Then, in the distance, a howl, and everything shifted. The first attack came fast. A dark shape burst from the tree line, silent but deadly, launching itself at the nearest sentry. A snarl, the flash of fangs, the wet crack of impact, and the night erupted into chaos. Aurora barely had time to react before more came. Dozens. Shapes emerging from the shadows, moving as one, their eyes gleaming like embers beneath the moon. The Fenrir clan had arrived. Ronan's transformation was instantaneous. One moment he was at her side, the next, his body twisted, expanded, fur erupting over thick muscle and bone. His wolf form landed with a deep guttural snarl, massive and lethal, the moonlight catching on his midnight dark fur. Then he was gone, vanishing into the fray, tearing through the first wave of attackers like a force of nature. Aurora's breath hitched. This wasn't like the last fight. This wasn't a skirmish. This was war. She barely dodged the first blade aimed for her, instinct kicking in as she twisted out of reach. She had no claws, no supernatural strength, but she had learned, and she wouldn't be helpless again. Grabbing a fallen dagger from the ground, she spun in time to meet her attacker, a man with cold eyes and a wicked snarl, his blade arsing toward her throat. She barely blocked it, the impact jarring, but she held firm. A roar split the air, a war cry, one that sent ice through her veins. She turned just in time to see one of the enemy wolves lunge for Ronan's back. No, she didn't think, didn't hesitate, she moved. Throwing herself forward, she slammed into the wolf's side, knocking its trajectory off, just enough to keep Ronan from taking the fatal hit. The enemy turned on her, snarling, and for a brief second she thought this was it. Then a blur of black and gold. Ronan's wolf slammed into the attacker, his growl bone deep, his fangs sinking into flesh. Aurora scrambled back, her pulse hammering as she watched Ronan tear through the enemy. It was over in seconds. Blood hit the ground, and when Ronan turned back to her, his golden eyes locking onto hers wild, frantic, a life she knew. This fight wasn't just about the pack, it was about them. And it was far from over. The night was chaos. Aurora moved through the battlefield, breath ragged, heart pounding, every muscle burning. The world was a blur of silver moonlight and blood-darkened earth, of snarls and war cries, of bodies clashing in a brutal, unrelenting rhythm. And then she saw him. Ronan was locked in a deadly fight, his massive wolf form a shadow of pure power, claws raking through flesh, fangs tearing into an enemy's throat. But for every opponent he felled, more came. And one was coming from behind. Aurora's chest seized. A Fenrir wolf, massive and brutal, its fur the color of iron, its eyes glowing with merciless intent. It moved with precision, its body coiling, ready to strike. A killing blow. She didn't think. Didn't hesitate. She ran. The wind tore at her, the ground uneven beneath her feet, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She wouldn't let Ronan die. But she was just a human. Just Aurora. She would never be fast enough. And then a whisper. Low. Ancient. Carried on the wind, through the chaos inside her bones. A memory surfaced. A fragment of the old lore Talia had shared with her days before. Our ancestors believed the bond between a fated pair could summon power. But only in moments of true need. When the heart speaks louder than fear. A heartbeat. A choice. Aurora let go. She didn't fight the energy that surged inside her, didn't question it. She simply gave in. Heat exploded in her chest raw and consuming not pain but something else. Power. Light burst from her hands, golden and wild, arcing through the air. It shot forward like lightning, slamming into the Fenrir wolf mid-lunge, sending it flying backward with a vicious, agonized snarl. The battlefield stilled. For one breathless moment, everything stopped. The enemy wolves hesitated, eyes wide with disbelief, with fear. The pack turned to Aurora, their faces reflecting shock, awe, recognition. Ronan shifted back into human form, chest heaving, blood smeared across his skin. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something changed in his gaze. Something deep. Something unchangeable. She had saved him. She had saved them all. The remaining Fenrir wolves faltered. The battle's momentum shattered. Their leader, snarling, barked a harsh command, and just like that, they were retreating, vanishing into the dark like smoke caught in the wind. Aurora swayed. Her vision blurred at the edges, the aftermath crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Then strong arms caught her. Ronan. He pulled her close, his touch both desperate and gentle, his breath hot against her temple. You, his voice was raw, shaking. You called the bond. She sagged against him, exhaustion weighing down her limbs. I don't even know what I did. He pressed his forehead against hers, his hold tightening. You became one of us. The words should have scared her, but they didn't. They felt like truth. Around them, the pack gathered bloodied but victorious. They had survived, but the air was thick with realization, with change. Aurora had bridged the divide. Human and wolf, mortal and magic. And now there was no turning back. The night had been cruel, but the morning was soft. The first rays of dawn broke over the treetops, streaking the sky in pale pink and hushed gold. Mist still clung to the earth, curling around the remnants of battle like a ghost that refused to leave. Smoke from the still smouldering fires drifted lazily into the air, carrying the scent of charred wood, earth, and something deeper, the unmistakable tang of blood and loss. Aurora stood at the edge of the village, her arms wrapped around herself as she took it all in. The pack moved slowly, some limping, others with blood drying against their skin or fur, their wounds hastily bandaged. The ground bore the weight of what had happened, scorched earth, broken weapons, the faint echoes of snarls and war cries, still lingering in the heavy morning air. But they had won. The Fenrir had retreated, and yet victory did not feel weightless. Aurora inhaled deeply, the crisp morning air filling her lungs. Every muscle in her body ached, exhaustion clinging to her bones. She lifted her hand and flexed her fingers, remembering the surge of power that had erupted from her the night before. It had been instinct, something that had awakened deep inside her, something that had always been there, waiting. Her mind replayed it over and over the moment she had let go, had trusted something beyond reason, beyond science, beyond the life she had once known. She wasn't the same woman who had stumbled into these woods, lost and uncertain. That woman had been searching for escape. Now she had found purpose. A soft rustling sounded behind her. She didn't have to turn to know it was Ronan. His presence was a warmth she had come to recognize, an energy that settled in her bones even before he spoke. "You should be resting," he murmured, his voice husky from exhaustion, but still steady. Aurora turned, her breath catching slightly at the sight of him. He looked tired, his face drawn, dark stubble shadowing his jaw, a fresh wound slicing across his collarbone. But his eyes, those golden eyes, held something unbreakable. "I needed to see," she admitted, "to understand what comes next." He studied her, his gaze lingering, searching. "And do you?" She glanced back at the village, the wolves working together, rebuilding, tending to the wounded, the unspoken strength woven into every movement. Yes, she understood now. This wasn't just a pack. It was a family. A world that existed on the edge of the one she had always known, built on something ancient, something sacred. Something she was now part of. Aurora looked back at Ronan, her heart steady, her voice unwavering. "I'm not leaving." A slow exhale. A flicker of relief, of something deeper, crossed his face. "I know." And just like that, the first light of morning wasn't just morning anymore. It was a beginning. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the pack gathered. They stood in a wide circle, their faces marked with exhaustion but resolved, their bodies still bearing the wounds of battle. The air smelled of damp earth, lingering smoke, and the coppery trace of blood. At the center of it all, Ronan stood beside Aurora, his presence a steady force against the weight of the moment. The elders were seated before them, their expressions grave but measuring. Jarek, the eldest among them, eyed Aurora with something unreadable, no longer doubt, but something closer to consideration. "You fought beside us," he said finally, his voice rough but even. "You could have run, but you didn't." Aurora lifted her chin, her fingers curling against her sides. "This is my fight too." Murmurs rippled through the gathered pack, some nodding in quiet approval, others still wary. Callum, younger but no less formidable, folded his arms. The prophecy never spoke of a human mate, never hinted at one. "No," Ronan agreed. "But the prophecy has always been about change, about what comes next." His voice was steady, deliberate. "Aurora didn't weaken us. She made us stronger." A hush fell over the circle. Aurora felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. The ancient traditions, the skepticism, the history of this pack, and where she fit in it. Then, slowly, Marisol, the sharp-eyed elder, who had questioned her the most, nodded. "The prophecy was never about blood," she said. "It was about unity." Her dark gaze settled on Aurora, assessing. "You are the bridge between two worlds. The one that binds us to what is coming." Aurora swallowed hard, her throat tightening at the words. "Acceptance." It was acceptance. Jarek exhaled, then reached into the folds of his cloak, pulling free a thin silver chain. The pendant hanging from it was small, but unmistakable, the mark of the pack. He stepped forward, and for the first time his gaze softened. "You walk with us now," he said. "From this moment on." Aurora's breath hitched. Jarek pressed the pendant into her palm, his fingers rough, weathered. "Wear it well." For the first time since she had stepped into this world, she felt whole. Ronan's hand found hers, his fingers tightening around hers in quiet reassurance. And as the pack let out a unified howl, one that echoed into the breaking dawn, Aurora knew she was home. The sky was painted in soft streaks of pink and gold, the first light of morning breaking across the horizon. Aurora stood at the edge of the forest, the earth still damp beneath her feet, the weight of the pendant Jarek had given her resting against her chest. Beside her, Ronan was silent, watching the light filter through the trees. His shirt was still torn from the battle, his knuckles bruised, But he stood strong, steady a man, a wolf, hers. She inhaled deeply, letting the crisp morning air fill her lungs. I still don't know what's coming next. Ronan glanced at her, his golden eyes filled with something certain, unshakable. We face it together. A slow breath. A quiet heartbeat. And then she reached for his hand. His fingers curled around hers, warm and solid, anchoring her. They stood there, unmoving, watching the sun rise over a world that had changed. Not just for them, for everyone. A future had been rewritten. A new chapter had begun. And whatever came next, they were ready. The village thrived. Aurora walked through the main clearing, the hum of life surrounding her. Laughter echoed from the training grounds where younger wolves sparred under the sharp eye of their mentors. Smoke curled from the chimneys, the scent of roasting meat mingling with fresh pine. The scars of battle had healed, leaving something stronger in their place, a pack united, whole. She had been here long enough now to see the shift. Where there had once been uncertainty, there was acceptance. Where wary glances had followed her every move, now there were nods, acknowledgement. This was her home. Aurora adjusted the silver pendant around her neck, her fingers brushing over its worn surface. It had been months since the battle, since the moment she had made her choice, since she had stood before the pack and claimed her place. She wasn't a wolf, but she was one of them. A sharp bark of laughter pulled her attention. Near the edge of the training grounds, Ronan stood with Callum and Talia, arms crossed, as he watched a younger wolf attempt to take down an opponent twice his size. His expression was unreadable, but Aurora knew him now, knew the subtle amusement in the way he tilted his head, the approval in his stance. His gaze flicked to hers, and just like always the world tilted. It still caught her off guard sometimes, the way he looked at her like she was his, like she had always been meant to be here. Like she belonged. Ronan murmured something to Callum, then crossed the distance between them. The moment he reached her, his fingers curled around her wrist, a quiet, familiar touch that sent warmth straight to her chest. "You didn't think you were getting out of training today," he said, voice low, teasing. Aurora smirked. "I thought being the pack's resident miracle meant I got special privileges." Ronan huffed, his thumb brushing over her pulse. "Not a chance." She laughed, easy and real. It still amazed her sometimes, this life she had found. She had spent so long running, looking for something she hadn't even known she needed. And now she had this, a home, a purpose, him. He pulled her closer, his other hand resting at the small of her back. The village bustled around them, but it didn't matter. Not when he was this close, not when his voice dropped just for her. "You still happy here?" She knew what he was really asking. Would she ever regret it? Would she ever long for the life she left behind? Aurora slid her hands up his chest, feeling the solid warmth beneath her fingertips. "You're stuck with me now, Ronan." His lips quirked, but his eyes burned with something deeper. Good. Then he kissed her slow, claiming, certain. And when she kissed him back, she knew this was forever.